Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Whispering Pines. The air was heavy with the scent of pine as four friends pulled their gear from the back of a dusty SUV. They had driven for hours to get here, to a place far removed from the buzz of their city lives. The trees here were massive, old, gnarled giants with twisted trunks and thick canopies that blocked out most of the sky. The forest felt ancient, as if it had seen too many seasons to count. But it was beautiful, the kind of place that made you feel small, insignificant, and somewhere deep inside, alive. "Can you believe we made it?" Sarah said, brushing a strand of hair from her face as she stared up at the towering trees. "Finally," replied Alex, tossing his bag over his shoulder. He was the one who had picked the spot, suggesting it as a perfect getaway for their little group. Somewhere isolated, somewhere peaceful. They set up camp in the small clearing, spreading out sleeping bags and setting up a fire pit. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Ethan, always the optimist, started unloading the cooler. He had been the most eager of all of them, excited for the weekend of hiking, campfires, and the chance to forget about everything for a while. "I'll take first watch," said Jake, leaning against a nearby rock as the others settled in around the campfire. "I'm not much of a sleeper anyway." The group settled into an easy rhythm, laughing, joking, and recounting old stories from college. The fire crackled, and the wind rustled through the trees, a constant whispering sound that seemed to come from all around them. It wasn't until the sun dipped below the horizon that the real feeling of unease began to set in. The forest, once alive with sounds of birds and insects, began to fall silent. The air grew cooler, and the whispers they changed. At first, Sarah thought it was just the wind, shifting the branches high above them. But the more she listened, the more distinct the sound became. The whispers weren't random gusts of air. They were voices, quiet, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. She looked around, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make sense of it. Jake, the closest to her, was already staring into the trees, his face taut with the same uncertainty. "You hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, his eyes darting from tree to tree. "Yeah, thought I was just imagining it." The others were too caught up in their own conversations to notice, but the whispers had taken on a different tone now. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was like a soft murmur, an indistinct chatter that made Sarah's skin crawl. She felt watched, like someone was out there in the dark listening to them. As night deepened, so did the unease. The fire flickered, casting dancing shadows around the camp. Sarah kept glancing nervously at the trees, her stomach turning. She didn't want to say anything and spoil the mood, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Okay, who's messing with us?" Alex's voice suddenly cut through the tension. "You hear that? Someone's out there." The others froze, turning toward him. He had his back to the fire, peering into the dark beyond the clearing. "I didn't hear anything," Ethan said, but his voice was too shaky for someone who hadn't been worried a second ago. Jake stood up, gripping his flashlight. "I'll go check it out," he said, already walking toward the edge of the clearing. "Don't be stupid," Sarah protested. "We should just stay put." But Jake was already too far gone, his footsteps crunching on the leaves as he ventured further into the trees. They watched him disappear into the darkness, the whispers growing louder, almost following him. Minutes passed, and the uneasy quiet stretched into what felt like hours. The fire crackled and popped, but the laughter and casual conversation had died off completely. They sat in a tense silence, waiting for Jake to return. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The stillness was deafening. A few more minutes passed, and Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She stood up, her heart pounding. "I'm going after him," she said, her voice shaking. "Wait, let's just give him more time," Alex said, though there was an edge of worry in his voice now. They all knew something wasn't right. They all knew Jake had been gone too long. But Sarah had already grabbed her flashlight and was stepping cautiously into the darkness, the beam cutting through the trees in front of her. Her heart raced as she pushed deeper into the forest, the whispering starting up again, but now it felt different, more urgent, more alive. "Jake," she called out, but the words felt wrong as soon as they left her mouth. There was no response, only the rustling of the leaves in the trees and the haunting echo of her own voice. Her flashlight bounced with each step, casting eerie shadows on the tree trunks. She wasn't sure how far she had gone when she saw something unnatural, on the ground ahead. A trail of blood-soaked footprints. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The blood was fresh, too fresh. It was a sickening sight, and it led deeper into the woods. "Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stepped closer, her feet crunching on the leaves. The whispers around her grew louder, more insistent, as if the forest itself was urging her to follow. She had to stop herself. Something in her gut told her that if she kept going, if she followed the trail, she might not come back. But then she heard something, a low, raspy breath. It came from behind her. She spun around, flashlight shaking in her hand. There was nothing, just the towering, ancient trees looming in the dark, their branches swaying like twisted fingers. A scream broke through the silence. It wasn't Jake. It was Ethan. Sarah bolted back toward the camp, her heart thumping so loudly she could hardly hear anything else. The firelight flickered in the distance, and she broke through the trees, skidding to a stop. Ethan was on the ground, his eyes wide with terror. His clothes were soaked in blood, his face pale and covered in a sheen of sweat. But it was his eyes that made her stomach twist, those wide, terrified eyes. He wasn't breathing, and he was staring at something beyond her. "Sarah," he rasped, but his voice was faint. His eyes darted to the trees. "It's watching." The whispering grew louder again, more frantic, almost demanding. Then, with a sickening crunch, the ground beneath Ethan seemed to shift. His body jerked, as if something was pulling him down, and Sarah's scream echoed through the trees. And in the silence that followed, the whispers continued, relentless. Story 2. The Old Lantern. The old campsite by the lake was exactly the kind of place no one visited anymore. hidden away from the nearest town by miles of tangled brush and dense trees. It had been abandoned for decades, left to rot under the weight of time. The wooden cabins, once sturdy and inviting, were now little more than skeletal remains, their walls cracked and their roofs sagging in defeat. The lake, which had once glittered in the sunlight, now seemed stagnant, its surface thick with algae and weeds. A place forgotten by both man and memory. When Sarah, her husband Ben, and their two kids, Emily and Jack, arrived, they were drawn to the isolation, the quiet that only the deep woods could provide. It wasn't supposed to be an adventure. Ben had planned it as a simple escape from the pressures of work and city life. A weekend, he said, just a weekend to reconnect away from the noise. We're camping. Ben had joked when they pulled up, as if it should have been a grand revelation. We'll have fun. Trust me. Sarah wasn't so sure. It wasn't the wilderness that bothered her. It was the place itself. There was something about the way the wind howled through the dead trees, the way the lake sat there, brooding and silent, as if waiting for something. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wood, old earth, and something else, something she couldn't place. She'd never liked abandoned places, not since she was a child, but Ben was determined, and the kids were excited. They unloaded the car, setting up tents and rummaging through the old, forgotten cabins. It wasn't until Emily wandered off toward the edge of the lake that things took a strange turn. "Mom, look at this." Emily's voice rang out, a mix of curiosity and awe. Sarah hesitated, glancing over at Ben, who was busy with the fire pit. She followed Emily down the trail to the water's edge. The girl stood there, holding something in her hand. A lantern. It wasn't anything special at first glance. The metal was rusted in places, the glass cloudy and dirty with age. But the light it gave off, though faint, was undeniably odd. It glowed with a soft green hue, as though it had its own life. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Emily said, turning it this way and that, watching the light flicker and sway in the wind. "I found it by the old dock." Sarah reached for the lantern, but when her fingers brushed against it, a coldness shot through her. Not a physical chill, but a deep, unsettling sense of something wrong. "You should leave that alone," she said quickly, pulling Emily's hand away. "It's probably been here for years. Who knows what kind of old junk people left behind." Emily pouted, but Sarah's words had a weight to them, and the girl reluctantly set the lantern down on the ground. Ben appeared behind them, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" "Just an old lantern," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "Nothing special." Ben bent down, inspecting it. His face tightened as he saw the green light flicker once more, a slight pulse that seemed to match the beat of his own heart. "Weird," he muttered. "It's like it's still working." He picked it up, and as soon as his fingers wrapped around the metal, a wave of nausea hit Sarah. It was like the lantern had drawn something out of him, some kind of pull that wasn't natural. She couldn't explain it. She couldn't even put it into words. But she had an overwhelming urge to leave. "We should keep it," Ben said, his voice distant. He was already moving toward the campfire, the lantern in hand. It didn't feel right, but Sarah stayed quiet. She didn't want to cause a scene. They set up the fire, and the family settled down around it. eating their simple dinner in the dimming light. But as the sun sank lower in the sky, the atmosphere around them shifted. The first thing Sarah noticed was the silence. There were no birds, no insects, no wind, just the sound of the fire crackling and the occasional murmur of her family's voices. The air grew colder, heavier, and then there were the footsteps. It wasn't immediately obvious. At first, Sarah thought it was just the sound of someone moving around, perhaps Ben going to check on the tent, or Emily running off to gather more firewood. But as the sound grew clearer, it became apparent that there was no one else around. Ben, she called out, her voice tight. Ben looked up from his phone, a strange expression on his face. "What is it? Did you hear that?" He listened for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "It's probably just the wind," he said, dismissing it with a wave. But it wasn't the wind. It happened again. Footsteps, soft, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere in the woods, somewhere beyond the light of the campfire. Sarah stood up, suddenly restless, her eyes scanning the darkness. There was nothing there. "Mom, I hear it too," Emily said in a whisper, her face pale. "Footsteps. It sounds like someone's walking around." "It's probably just some animals," Ben said, but his voice lacked conviction. As the night wore on, the strange noises persisted. There were whispers on the wind, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the very trees. And the footsteps, they grew louder, as if something or someone was circling them, inching closer with each passing minute. Ben had had enough. "I'm going to check it out," he said, standing up. "Stay here." Before Sarah could protest, he was already moving toward the woods, the lantern hanging from his hand. Its green light shimmered in the dark like some unnatural star, beckoning him forward. "Ben, wait," Sarah called, but he didn't hear her. Or perhaps he didn't care. Her stomach twisted. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. It wasn't long before she heard him call out from the shadows, his voice strained, uneasy. "Sarah, you need to come here. You need to see this." With a chill crawling up her spine, Sarah grabbed Emily and Jack, and they hurried toward the source of Ben's voice. The lantern illuminated the way, casting eerie, sickly light over the path. When they reached him, Sarah stopped dead in her tracks. Ben was standing there, staring at something in the distance. His face was slack, pale, his eyes wide with terror. In front of him, near the water's edge, stood figures. Figures dressed in old, tattered clothing, their faces obscured by shadow. But there was no mistaking the way they moved, slowly, as if they were somehow bound to the earth, tethered by something deeper than their own will. They weren't there before, Ben whispered, his voice trembling. They weren't here. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the figures slowly turned toward them, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Not human eyes, though. Not like anything she had ever seen before. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the figures vanished into the night, leaving only a faint echo of their footsteps behind. The lantern, still glowing with its eerie green light, flickered in Ben's hand. "We have to leave," Sarah said, her voice shaking with terror. "Now." But as they turned to go, something new caught their attention. The footsteps, faint at first, began again, but this time they weren't coming from the forest. They were coming from behind them, and the lantern, glowing softly, was beckoning them into the darkness. The family never made it out of the woods that night. They never made it out of the woods at all. And the lantern? It still burns, waiting for someone else to stumble upon it, drawn by its pull. Story 3. The Campfire Ghosts. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind that made your lungs ache with the rawness of the wild. It was late in the summer, that season just before fall claimed the woods, and the air was cool enough for a fire, but not so cold as to discourage the campers from telling their stories. The fire crackled and popped, sending a faint, warm glow over the faces of the small group gathered around it, casting their shadows long and dark on the ground. 5 of them were here this weekend. 3 college friends and 2 brothers, all from a nearby town, looking for something to break the monotony of everyday life. Mark, the oldest of the group, had picked the campsite. He was the leader, the one who knew all the good spots and had the survival gear to prove it. They had been camping together since high school, a tradition that had stuck long after they'd left school and drifted apart. But tonight, there was something different in the air. It wasn't just the chill settling in as the night deepened, or the way the wind seemed to murmur through the trees. It was the stories. There was an old tale about the cave nearby, a story so well known among the locals that it was almost a rite of passage to hear it told around a campfire. Mark, sensing the mood of the night, was the first to bring it up. "Who wants to hear the story about the ghost in the cave?" he asked, his voice low but eager. Sam, the younger brother, shrugged. "I've heard it 100 times. Well, maybe you'll hear it differently tonight," Mark said with a grin. The fire flickered, sending odd shadows leaping across their faces. In the distance, the cave entrance was just a black hole in the side of a small hill, surrounded by thick underbrush. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves and bending the trees in odd ways. It felt like the woods themselves were listening. Tommy, the quiet one, leaned back on his elbows and grinned. "Isn't that just the story about the guy who got lost in the cave and never came out?" he said, repeating the most basic version of the tale. "Yeah," Mark replied, "but that's the watered-down version. Here's the full story." The others leaned in, sensing something different in Mark's tone. "It happened years ago, before any of us were born," he began, his voice dropping to a whisper. "A man named Paul Bradford came to these woods looking for something. Probably adventure, maybe just peace, who knows. He was an experienced hiker, they say. He'd heard the stories about the cave, but he didn't believe them. Thought it was just a local legend. He thought the whole thing was a joke. But he was wrong." Mark paused for a moment, letting the weight of the silence fall around them. The crackle of the fire seemed louder now, more pronounced. Bradford went into the cave one afternoon and never came back out. The people from the town searched for days, but they couldn't find him. There were reports that said they heard noises, strange whispers coming from deep inside the cave. But nothing was ever found, and the search was called off. He stared into the fire, his face dimly lit by the flames. But that's not the end of it. It's said that at night you can hear him, the whispers, his voice calling out from the cave, begging for help. But the weird thing is, no one ever finds him. Not a body, not even a trace. Sam scoffed. "It's just an old ghost story, man. You're not going to convince me there's some dude wandering around in the cave. Mark smiled but didn't answer. Instead, he let the silence stretch for a long moment, the crackling of the fire filling the void. When he spoke again, his voice was a little softer, almost tentative. Here's the part one didn't tell you. People say that Bradford isn't alone in there. They say there's something else, something that feeds on the lost souls of the woods, something that traps people inside. And once it has you, it won't ever let you go. Tommy raised an eyebrow. You really expect me to believe that? Mark nodded slowly. It said that Bradford's soul was never allowed to leave, and he became a part of whatever's in that cave, too. The wind howled louder now, the trees creaking as though they were groaning under some unseen pressure. The fire danced wildly, throwing shadows in all directions. A chill ran down everyone's spine as the darkness pressed in around them, the only light coming from the dying embers. Tommy, eager to break the tension, let out a nervous laugh. Okay, so what? We're supposed to go looking for him? You guys are crazy. But Sam looked at the cave. His eyes were wide, his expression unreadable. What if it's real? He murmured, almost to himself. The others laughed nervously, but the sound didn't reach their eyes. There was something about the cave tonight that made the story feel a little too real, the night too quiet, the fire too small. As the hours passed, they grew more subdued, less eager to talk, and the air grew colder. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves with an unnerving intensity. The only sound now was the crackling of the fire and the distant call of an owl. It was then that they noticed it. At first, it was a faint glimmer, just a flicker of light from the direction of the cave. Then it appeared again, glowing eyes. At first, they thought it was the reflection of the firelight off some animal's eyes. But as the glowing dots shifted, they realized something wasn't right. These weren't the eyes of any animal they knew. They stared, frozen, as the eyes blinked, then disappeared into the darkness of the trees. The campers exchanged nervous glances, their breath coming in quick bursts. "Did you see that?" Sam whispered, his voice shaking. Mark, the confident one, stood up. "It's just an animal," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Probably a raccoon or something," but they could all feel it. The tension in the air, the weight of something just beyond their sight. Then, another pair of eyes appeared, this time closer. And this time, they were different. These eyes weren't just glowing. They seemed to pulse, as if alive. Tommy stood up, backing away slowly. "We need to go. Now." But Mark shook his head. "No. Stay calm. It's just the dark playing tricks." But the eyes didn't stop watching them. They blinked, and then they moved, closer, more deliberate, like they were circling. Something in the air shifted, the temperature dropping rapidly. The fire sputtered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. Suddenly, there was a sound, a soft whisper, as if someone was speaking just beyond the trees. The voice was low, guttural, but distinct. "Help me." The voice was unmistakably human. Sam froze, his face drained of color. "It's him," he whispered. "It's Bradford." The whispers continued, growing louder, more urgent. The eyes were everywhere now, circling them, watching them from the trees, from the shadows. A low growl vibrated in the ground beneath their feet, and the air smelled sour, like decay. Then, in an instant, it all went silent. The fire flickered one last time and died, plunging them into complete darkness. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. The whispers were gone. The eyes, too, had disappeared. But the horror of that silence, the feeling that they were not alone, that something unseen and ancient had circled them, lingered long after the fire was out, long after they scrambled back to their tents and huddled together in fear. No one spoke much after that night. No one made jokes, and no one ever went back to that cave. Some stories are better left untold. Some ghosts better left in the dark. Story 4. The Hollow Echo. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional snap of a twig underfoot and the distant rustle of leaves. Dense fog hung low over the ground, making the trees appear as though they were part of some half-forgotten dream. To anyone unfamiliar with the area, it might have seemed eerie, but to a group of 4 friends, Danny, Rachel, Mark, and Sarah, it was the perfect setting for a weekend camping trip. They had been looking forward to the escape for weeks. Life had been too noisy, too full of distractions and responsibilities. The city, the pressures of work, the grind. The woods were supposed to offer an antidote. They set up camp by a small clearing, nestled deep within the forest. The fire crackled, casting long, flickering shadows on the trees around them. "It's perfect," Mark said, grinning as he looked around. He tossed a few more logs onto the fire, watching the flames leap higher. "Quiet, peaceful." Rachel nodded, pulling her jacket tighter against the evening chill. She glanced up at the fog rolling in, thickening as the day turned to night. "Spooky," she said, half joking. "Feels like one of those ghost stories you hear when you're a kid." Sarah smiled, but there was something about the fog, something about the air, that unsettled her. The way it hung in the trees, swallowing up the trail they'd followed to get here. "Yeah, but we're here now, so let's make the most of it." As the night deepened, the firelight grew dim. The woods around them seemed to breathe in the darkness. Every rustle of the leaves sharp in the air. They were alone, just the 4 of them, and the isolation felt complete, almost as if the world had fallen away. There was no one for miles, no cars, no other campers, just them and the deep woods. After dinner, Sarah suggested they go for a walk, stretch their legs. She was the one who loved exploring the forest, always seeking out the hidden corners of nature. "Come on, it'll be fun," she urged, her voice light but insistent. Reluctantly, the others agreed. It was a chance to get away from the fire's smoke and the weight of silence pressing down on them. They wandered deeper into the woods, stepping carefully over roots and rocks, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves on the forest floor. The fog clung to their clothes, dampening the air with its wet breath. It wasn't long before they found it. Just ahead, partially obscured by the trees, was a deep hollow, a kind of small ravine. Its edges were jagged, as though some unseen force had torn the earth apart, leaving the darkened space at its center. At first, they simply stared at it, unsure of what to make of it. The hollow was silent, too silent. No rustling of animals, no distant sounds of water or wind. Just emptiness. What do you think? Danny asked, frowning. Looks weird, right? Rachel stepped closer, her voice barely audible as she peered into the darkness. It's like a big hole in the earth, but it's different somehow. Mark, always the skeptic, shrugged. Probably just a sinkhole or something. No big deal. But Sarah felt drawn to it. The air around the hollow was heavy, and there was something almost magnetic about it. She couldn't help herself. She leaned in, and in a soft voice, almost as if compelled, she whispered into the hollow, "Is anyone down there?" The sound of her words echoed back at her, but not as they should have. It wasn't a simple echo. It was distorted, warped, and stretched out, like a voice that wasn't her own. "Is anyone down there?" the hollow replied, but it wasn't Sarah's voice. It was a low, unfamiliar sound, a deep tone filled with something malevolent. Her heart skipped in her chest. She took a step back. "Did you hear that?" Mark chuckled nervously, but there was an edge to his laughter. "Yeah, I heard it. Let's get out of here." That was creepy, but Rachel wasn't ready to leave just yet. "It's probably just the way the sound travels," she said, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Maybe there's a cavern or something." She leaned in close to the hollow and whispered, "Hello." This time, the hollow responded with a voice that was softer, gentler, almost like a coaxing whisper. "Hello, Rachel." Rachel froze. She glanced at the others, her face pale. That wasn't me." It wasn't just the way it echoed back. It was the way the hollow seemed to know her name. The way it felt so personal. "Okay, that's enough," Danny said, his voice tight with discomfort. "Let's go back to camp. This is getting weird." But Sarah, curious, driven by something she didn't fully understand, leaned in again, her voice a barely audible whisper. "Tell me what you know. Why are you here?" The hollow's response was immediate, but this time it wasn't a voice. It was a thought, a dark, invasive thought that felt like it was coming from deep inside her own mind. "Tell them all." The thought was not hers. It was an intrusion, an invasive force pushing against the walls of her consciousness. Her breath hitched, and she stumbled backward. "We need to go," she said, her voice shaking. But when they tried to leave, they found the woods weren't the same. The trees seemed to close in on them. The path they had walked down moments ago now twisted and turned in strange, impossible ways. The fog thickened, enveloping them in a suffocating blanket. They couldn't see more than a few feet in front of them, and the air grew colder, heavier. It was as if the forest was no longer just a place. It was a prison, and the hollow had become the warden. The next morning, the group awoke to find themselves back at camp. The fog had lifted, the sun shining brightly through the trees. But something was wrong. The echoes of the hollow still lingered in the back of their minds, like an itch that couldn't be scratched. The unease was palpable. They couldn't stop thinking about it. And worse, the thoughts weren't their own. Danny, who had always been the confident one, found himself suddenly paranoid. His mind fixated on the idea that Rachel had been hiding something from him. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was keeping a secret, one that could tear the group apart. Rachel, on the other hand, had started to feel an overwhelming guilt, as if something she had done had triggered something darker. The hollow had known her, had whispered to her, "Hello, Rachel," and the weight of that knowledge was crushing her. Mark, usually easygoing, had become restless, snapping at everyone over the smallest things. His temper was quick, and he began to argue with Sarah, accusing her of leading them into this mess. "You were the one who heard the hollow first. You brought us here," he spat, his eyes wild. And Sarah, she could hear the hollow's voice in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, it was there, whispering to her, pushing her deeper into madness. She could feel it, whatever it was, growing stronger, feeding off their fear, their distrust. By the third night, things had reached a breaking point. The air was thick with tension. They couldn't look at each other without feeling the weight of the thoughts that weren't their own. And then, just as it had started, it happened again. The hollow called to them, not with words, but with a pull, an irresistible force. They couldn't resist. One by one, they went to the hollow. But this time, it wasn't just their voices that echoed. The hollow reflected their darkest thoughts back at them, and in that moment, they realized the truth. The hollow didn't just echo voices. It echoed fear, paranoia, guilt. It made their darkest thoughts manifest, twisting their minds, turning them against each other. And they were helpless to stop it. As the last echo faded into the night, the woods around them fell silent again. Only the fog remained, thick and suffocating, waiting for the next group to stumble into its grasp. The hollow had claimed them all, and it would never let them go. Story 5. The Beast Beneath. The last rays of the setting sun filtered through the dense canopy of the national park, casting long shadows across the campsite. It was supposed to be a weekend to remember, a quiet escape from the noise of city life. But there was something unsettling about the place, something none of them could put into words. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles, and the only sound was the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. There were 4 of them. Jacob, the leader of the group, always the one who took charge, who planned every detail of their adventures. Then there was Mia, his girlfriend, who loved the outdoors but always had an eye on her phone, hoping for a signal. Derek, the joker, who made everyone laugh but had a habit of pushing boundaries. And Emily, the quiet one, who wasn't quite sure why she'd agreed to come in the first place, but went along anyway because, well, they were friends. They had set up camp near the edge of the woods, a place marked on their map as a popular spot for hikers. But as night began to fall, the place seemed different, darker, quieter than expected. Jacob had noticed it first. The tracks, a large footprint, too big to be human, near the edge of their campsite. He thought it might be from a bear, but something about the way it was shaped didn't sit right with him. The toes were too elongated, and the indentation was too deep. He didn't mention it at first, but his mind kept returning to the print. Later, as they sat around the fire, the laughter and the warmth of the flames seemed to push the feeling of unease away. But Jacob couldn't shake the nagging thought that something was watching them. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on their eyes. Derek made a joke about Sasquatch being out there, hiding in the dark, but Jacob wasn't laughing. "Think we should check the trees around the campsite?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically tense. Mia rolled her eyes, slapping him playfully on the arm. "Jacob, you're always overthinking things. It's just a bear, or maybe a wolf. It's a national park. They're animals, not monsters." Jacob wasn't so sure. His instinct told him there was something more. It wasn't until the next morning that their fears began to solidify. Jacob had decided to venture deeper into the woods. He wanted to get a better look at the tracks, and maybe he'd find something that would put his mind at ease. Mia and Derek reluctantly agreed to go with him, though Emily, as usual, hesitated. "I'm fine here," she said, sitting back on a rock, her eyes scanning the trees. "I'll keep an eye on the camp." The others made their way through the trees, following the path that twisted and turned deeper into the wilderness. The air grew heavier as they moved farther from camp, the canopy of trees above them thick and almost suffocating. The quiet was oppressive. The only sound was their footsteps and the occasional call of a distant bird. And then they found it, a set of deep claw marks on a tree, as if something large and powerful had raked its way down the bark. The marks were fresh, the sap still glistening around the edges. "Damn," Derek muttered, stepping closer to inspect them. "That's not a bear. Not unless it has claws like knives." Jacob felt a shiver run down his spine. He crouched down, running his fingers along the scratches. There were no other animals around. No birds, no small creatures darting through the underbrush. Just an eerie, unnatural silence. "Let's go back," Mia said, her voice a little shaky. She glanced over her shoulder as if something might be following them. Jacob wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. He motioned for them to keep going. "We need to know what we're dealing with here." They pushed forward, cutting through the dense undergrowth, their senses on high alert. As they walked, they noticed more signs, more claw marks on trees, deeper prints in the dirt, and then a sudden, overpowering stench in the air. It was musky, rank, like something that had been dead too long. "Something's out there," Jacob said, his voice low. And then Derek froze. He held up his hand, signaling for the others to stop. The air seemed to grow colder, and the distant howls of wolves, now unusually close, seemed to echo through the trees. A low growl. It wasn't far, somewhere to their left, hidden among the thick brush. "What the hell is that?" Mia whispered, clutching Jacob's arm. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced. The growl was too deep, too primal. It sounded almost human. "Stay quiet," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get back to the camp. Now." But as they turned to leave, the growl came again, closer this time. It sent a chill through Jacob's spine, something cold and primal. Something massive shifted in the trees. The branches shook, a deep rumble rolling through the ground beneath their feet. Derek cursed under his breath. "What the hell is that?" It wasn't until they turned back toward the trail that they saw it. Emerging from the thick woods, its massive frame outlined against the tree line. A creature, its body a twisted mass of fur and muscle, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Its mouth was too wide, its teeth too long, and its claws the same as the ones they had seen on the trees. The thing stood on all fours, but with an unnatural grace, almost too still for something so large. "Run!" Jacob shouted. They didn't hesitate. They sprinted through the trees, their hearts pounding, their breaths ragged as they pushed through the underbrush. The creature followed them, slowly at first, then faster, its growls reverberating through the forest. It was getting closer, its enormous paws thudding against the earth with every step. They reached the edge of the forest, the campsite barely visible through the trees. But as they neared, something stopped them cold. The campsite was empty. Emily was gone. "Emily?" Jacob called, his voice shaking with panic. There was no answer, only the crackling of the fire that had long since burned out. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist around them, thick and oppressive. They searched the area frantically, calling her name, but the forest was silent. And then the growl came again. Jacob whipped around, his blood running cold. The creature was right there, too close, its eyes gleaming in the dark. It was no longer stalking them. It was hunting them. The group backed up, but before they could run, the ground beneath their feet gave way. They fell into a pit, dark, deep, and unseen until it was too late. The earth was soft and wet, and the air smelled of rot and decay. The pit seemed endless, like it had been there for centuries, a hole carved by something ancient. In the silence, Jacob could hear the faintest sound, the scraping of claws against rock. Something large was below them, something ancient, something waiting. And as he lay there in the dark, in the beast's shadow, he understood. The creature had always been there, watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And now, it had found them, the beast beneath. Story 6. The cries from the cliff. The campsite was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that gnaws at you, settles deep in your bones. It was meant to be a peaceful weekend away from everything. No phones, no emails, just a few friends, a crackling campfire, and the dark, foreboding cliffs towering above them. But peace wasn't on the menu this weekend. Not this time. 3 friends, Tom, Karen, and Derek, had set up camp on the cliffside, a spot so remote that even the trail to get there felt like it had been forgotten by time. The river far below churned with the kind of dark energy that only deep water can carry, twisting and turning over jagged rocks. They'd been told this place was special, a hidden gem where the city's noise couldn't reach them. But as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, something about the place felt off, like the earth itself was holding its breath. The firelight flickered in the growing darkness, casting long shadows over the ground. Tom poked at the embers, trying to keep the fire alive, his gaze flicking nervously to the dark void beyond the camp. The cliffs loomed high and forbidding, their sharp edges cutting into the night sky. Karen tried to break the tension with a joke, something about how they should be scared of the bears and not the cliff. But Derek, the quiet one, only half listened. He was staring out into the fog, his hand gripping the bottle of whiskey he had brought. "It's too damn quiet," he muttered. "I thought that's what we wanted," Karen teased, but she wasn't smiling. The air had a weight to it, a heaviness that made her feel like they weren't alone. Not exactly in the way you feel when you're being watched, but something else, something older, like the earth itself had memories, and it didn't want to forget them. Then, just as the last bit of daylight disappeared, it happened. A noise, so chilling and unnatural it froze them all in place. A cry. It was distant at first, a faint wail that echoed off the cliffs. It wasn't human, not the way a person would scream. This was something deeper, something primal, like the land itself was crying out in pain. Tom stood up, his legs shaky as he tried to peer into the fog. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I don't know," Karen replied, her voice tight. "It sounds like someone's in trouble. Maybe someone fell." Derek stood as well, slowly, his eyes wide, like he was seeing something none of them could. "That's no fall," he said. "That's something else." Another cry rang out, louder this time, closer. The sound seemed to come from the very edge of the cliff, as if it were rising up from the churning river below. Without another word, the three of them grabbed their flashlights and made their way toward the edge of the cliff, the beam of light cutting through the thickening fog. The wind picked up, tugging at their jackets, as the wail grew louder, almost desperate. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, loose rocks shifting with every step. The air was thick with moisture, and the further they walked, the colder it got. Tom could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He was beginning to wish he had stayed by the fire. They reached the cliff's edge, the sound now deafening, but when they looked down, they saw nothing. The river was a black ribbon of water, swirling violently below them, but there was no one in sight. No struggling figure, no sign of life, just the echo of the cry, lingering in the air. "I told you," Derek said, his voice strained. "It's not right." Tom shook his head, trying to shake off the unease that settled in his stomach. "There's nothing here. Maybe it's an animal. Something stuck." Karen didn't seem convinced. She pointed to a small ledge that jutted out just a few feet from where they stood. "Maybe someone was there. I don't know. I don't like this." They stood there for a few moments longer, listening to the emptiness of the cliff. The wind whipped around them, carrying the cries in all directions, but nothing else. Finally, Tom turned to head back to the camp. "We should just head back. If someone is down there, they're not going to be able to hear us." The others agreed, but as they turned, the cry rang out again, closer now, right behind them. A long, drawn-out wail that seemed to vibrate the very air around them. They spun around. Nothing. Tom's heart skipped a beat. "What the hell?" I don't know," Karen whispered, her face pale in the flashlight's glow. Derek was the first to break the silence. "We should go back to the fire. Now." They hurried back toward the campsite, their legs trembling beneath them. As they neared the clearing, something caught Tom's eye, a flash of white in the mist near the fire. At first, he thought it was just the fog playing tricks on him, but then he saw it again. A torn piece of clothing, hanging on the edge of the camp's blanket. Tom's blood ran cold. "Where's Derek?" They spun around. Derek had been walking right behind them, but now, nothing. The fire crackled, casting strange shadows on the ground, but there was no sign of their friend. "Derek?" Karen called out, her voice shaking. There was no answer. Tom felt his throat tighten. He was right behind us. The only sound was the wind whistling through the trees, and then a whisper, a faint echo of something that wasn't quite right. "Derek!" Tom called again, this time his voice trembling. And then it came, A voice, soft at first, like the rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Help me." It was Derek's voice. Tom froze. He knew it wasn't possible. Derek had been right behind them, but now it came from the cliff. His heart slammed in his chest as the voice called again, clearer this time, a tortured sound that made Tom's skin crawl. "Help me, Tom, Karen." Derek's name echoed through the fog, bouncing off the cliffside, but when they looked, there was nothing. "No," Karen whispered, stepping backward. "This isn't real." But the voice kept calling, and it wasn't just Derek anymore. It was everyone they had ever known, their families, their friends, all calling from the cliff. Tom's mind raced. He turned, looking for something, anything to explain it, but the fog was closing in. The dark river below seemed to grow louder, more threatening, as if it were swallowing them whole. The voice came again. "Help me." And this time, it was Derek's voice, growing weaker, desperate. They couldn't stay. They had to leave. But when they turned to run, the fog had swallowed the path. The way back was gone. They were trapped. Somewhere in the mist, something was watching them. And the cries would not stop until they joined the others, their voices swallowed by the cliffs. Story 7. The Return of Hollow Creek. The wind blew a mournful tune through the trees as Sarah and Ben pulled their car to a stop on the gravel road that led to Hollow Creek. It had been years, too many years, and yet the place still felt the same. A patchwork of forgotten memories, overgrown weeds, and the same quiet, eerie stillness that had been there when they were kids. Sarah looked out the window, half expecting the creek to be running again, as if the land itself was remembering. But it was dry. The creek bed was just a wide, dusty gash in the earth. Ben turned off the engine and looked at her with a raised eyebrow. "You sure about this?" Sarah nodded, but her stomach churned. "It's just it feels like the right place." Ben didn't argue. He never did when it came to Sarah's ideas. They had been together since high school, and despite everything, he knew her well enough to trust her instincts, even when they didn't make sense. He reached over and squeezed her hand before they both got out of the car, the gravel crunching underfoot. Their footsteps echoed louder than they should have, the sound of their presence cutting through the stillness of the forgotten campground. There was something off about the place, something Sarah couldn't quite put into words, even though it was the same as it had been when they were children. The same crooked signs, the same half-collapsed cabins, and the same woods that stretched endlessly in every direction. But this time, something felt heavier in the air. Ben set down the cooler and camping gear and glanced around. "I thought there was supposed to be a view of the creek from here." "There is," Sarah said, her voice distant. She stepped forward, walking to the edge of the dried-up creek bed. It was even worse than she remembered. The trees that had once lined the water were gnarled and bare, their roots twisted like the hands of something long dead. The creek itself, a narrow stream of life in their childhood memories, was now just a long, lifeless stretch of cracked earth. "Nothing left of it," Ben muttered. "Not even a trickle." Sarah nodded. Her thoughts weren't on the creek. They hadn't been for years. Instead, she found herself staring at a familiar patch of land at the far end of the dried bed, a place where she and Ben had once played as children. They used to camp here every summer their families together before the tragedy. The tragedy. Do you ever think about them? Sarah asked softly, her voice trembling just enough that Ben noticed. He didn't answer right away. His eyes followed hers to the spot where the small cabin once stood. That was where the Johnsons had stayed, the family who'd vanished that fateful night. He didn't need to say anything. The memories hung between them, thick and suffocating, like the smoke from an old campfire that never quite dissipated. Ben cleared his throat. I try not to. I know, Sarah said. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. I never thought we'd be back here. Not after everything that happened. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew that returning to Hollow Creek after all these years was a way to face the past, to make peace with it, if that was even possible. But there was a gnawing feeling deep in Sarah's chest, a feeling that returning here might do more harm than good. The tragedy was still raw, even after all these years. It was the kind of thing that people talked about in whispers, a nightmare that had swallowed up a family without a trace. 1 minute, they were all gathered by the campfire, laughing, telling stories, and the next, they were gone, swept away by a flash flood that seemed to come out of nowhere. No warning, no sign, just a sudden surge of water that drowned everything in its path. They found the bodies weeks later, downstream, half buried in the muck. But not all of them. The youngest, a little girl, was never found. Sarah shook her head, trying to push the memories away. I'm going to start setting up the tent. Ben looked at her for a moment, but said nothing. He knew better than to argue with her now. Instead, he began unpacking the cooler and the firewood, trying to keep his mind occupied. But even as he worked, his eyes kept drifting back to the creek bed. The silence hung heavy, a reminder of the life that had once thrived here, and the life that had been taken so suddenly, so violently. As night fell, the air grew colder. The wind picked up, rustling the trees and carrying with it the faintest scent of decay. Ben didn't like it. There was something about the wind tonight, something wrong, as if the forest was breathing, alive with something that shouldn't be. Ben, Sarah's voice broke through the tension, her voice distant, as if she were calling from another world. He turned, startled, and found her standing at the edge of the creek bed. Her eyes were wide, her hand gripping the edge of the dry earth, as though it were the only thing keeping her from being swallowed whole. Sarah, what's wrong? Ben rushed toward her, but she didn't move. She didn't even acknowledge him. Instead, her gaze was fixed on something in the distance, something that wasn't there a moment ago. The creek bed was filling with water. Not slowly, not over time. It was rising, impossibly fast, as though the land itself had decided to reclaim what had been taken from it all those years ago. The water was black, thick like oil, and it moved in unnatural ways, sloshing and swirling, as if something deep beneath the surface was stirring. Ben, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. It's happening again. Ben froze, his blood running cold as he looked out at the water. He could feel it now, the way the air had changed, the way the ground seemed to hum beneath his feet. The past was alive here, breathing again, and something had been waiting for them to return. Ben, we need to go. Now. Sarah's voice cracked as she turned toward him, her eyes wide with fear. He didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed her arm and yanked her away from the creek, but it was too late. The water had reached the edge of the campground, rushing toward them with a force they couldn't outrun. The wind howled, and in the distance, he could hear the faint sound of rushing water. But it wasn't the creek. It wasn't natural. It was the sound of something much darker, something that had been waiting in the depths of Hollow Creek for far too long. They ran, but the water followed. The creek was alive again, and it was pulling them back into its deadly embrace. In the distance, at the edge of the trees, Ben thought he saw something moving. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, standing at the edge of the water, watching. Watching them, the Johnsons, the ones who never left, the ones who were never truly gone. And now, they were here, waiting for Sarah and Ben to join them. To complete the circle, the creek would claim them too, and this time it would not let them go. Story 8. The Bone Collector. It was late September when 6 friends, Tom, Sarah, Jake, Emily, Ben, and Claire, decided to spend the weekend camping in Black Hollow Woods, a remote, mist-shrouded forest at the foot of the Adirondacks. They'd heard the old stories, the whispers of a creature that collected bones in the forest, a tale passed down for generations. But like most young people, they dismissed it as nothing more than superstition. The thrill of escaping the city for a weekend of hiking, laughter, and campfires was far more appealing. They set up camp by a small stream, its gentle gurgling a welcome contrast to the muffled world around them. The woods were dense, the trees towering and ancient, their limbs draped in moss that glowed faintly under the moonlight. As night descended, the air grew thick with mist, curling around the trunks of the trees and making everything seem unreal. After a dinner of canned chili and hot dogs, they gathered around the campfire, the crackling flames the only source of warmth in the cold air. Tom, the most skeptical of the group, laughed at the others as they recounted stories about Black Hollow Woods, stories of the Bone Collector. The Bone Collector? Tom scoffed, taking a swig of beer. Seriously? That's the scariest thing you can come up with. Jake grinned. It's a local legend. They say it's a creature that stalks the forest, collecting the bones of its victims. It doesn't kill them all at once. No, it collects them piece by piece over time. Fingers, ribs, toes, until there's nothing left. Sarah shivered, but Claire chuckled. Sounds like a story made up to keep people from wandering too far. I'm not afraid of some old ghost story. The night wore on, the sound of the fire crackling and the occasional hoot of an owl breaking the silence. But as the hours passed, the woods seemed to grow darker, the mist thickening, swirling closer to their camp. It was around midnight when Ben, who had been the first to retire to his tent, emerged in a panic. "Guys, you need to see this," he said, his voice trembling. "Come quick." The group followed Ben into the woods, the beam of their flashlights cutting through the fog. They found him standing near a cluster of trees, staring at the ground. "What is it, Ben?" Emily asked, her voice tight with unease. Ben pointed to a pile of bones, a grisly collection of scattered ribs, broken fingers, and what looked like the skull of a small animal. Each bone was unnaturally clean, stripped of any flesh, and meticulously arranged. It wasn't a random pile. It was as if someone or something had carefully placed each piece one by one. "What the hell is that?" Jake whispered, stepping closer to the pile. His breath came out in short bursts, and his eyes flicked nervously around the dark forest. "Who would leave something like this out here?" Tom muttered, his usual bravado gone. He knelt to inspect the bones, running his fingers over them. There was no sign of decay, no sign of rot. They looked too fresh. Sarah shivered. "We should get out of here." "Now." "Yeah," Claire said, her voice quiet but insistent. "This is too creepy. Let's pack up and go back to the cars." They all agreed, though a sense of unease had already settled over the group. No one spoke as they hurried back to the camp, the oppressive mist surrounding them like a living thing. But when they reached the campsite, something was wrong. The tents were still there, but it didn't feel like their camp anymore. It felt unfamiliar, as if they'd never been there at all. "What the hell?" Ben said, looking around in confusion. "Where's the trail back to the road?" The trees around them seemed to stretch taller, their shadows lengthening, their branches reaching out like twisted hands. Claire fumbled with the map, but it didn't make sense. "This can't be right. We should be right here, but the map doesn't match." Sarah's eyes widened. "The road? It's gone. The trail is gone." Ben turned to face the group, his eyes wide with panic. This is impossible. We were just on that trail. We followed it back. This can't be happening." A cold gust of wind blew through the trees, the leaves rustling like whispers in the night. The mist thickened, and for a brief moment, the group was disoriented, as if the very landscape had shifted around them. Tom stepped forward, trying to hold it together. "We're just lost. Let's calm down, find the trail again, and head back to the car." There's no reason to panic. But the panic had already begun to seep into the group, like the fog that was now closing in around them. Each one of them could feel it, a presence, something watching from the trees. The air was thick with it. They tried to retrace their steps, but with every turn, the forest seemed to stretch farther, deeper into the unknown. The trees, once familiar, now felt like they were closing in, their trunks twisting in ways that weren't natural. Every path they took led them deeper into the woods, further from the safety of the campfire. Hours passed, but the forest never let up. The group's anxiety reached a boiling point as they stumbled through the dense undergrowth, tripping over roots, getting tangled in thorns, and growing more and more disoriented. It was Jake who screamed first. "Look," he yelled, pointing toward the ground. "There's more bones." They all turned to see another pile, just like the first. This one was bigger, more bones, more pieces arranged with the same eerie precision. "God, it's real," Sarah whispered, backing away. Suddenly, Emily gasped. "What's that? What's that on the tree?" A shape, a figure. High in the branches, barely visible in the mist, something was hanging. It was humanoid, but not quite. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and its face was a twisted mask of bone, with hollow eyes that seemed to watch them. Ben froze. That thing, it's been following us." Panic surged through the group as they turned to run, but the forest had changed again. The trees had shifted, and every direction led them deeper into the heart of the woods. Every exit from the forest seemed to loop back on itself, drawing them into the center, where something waited, something ancient and hungry. In the distance, they heard a rustling, the unmistakable sound of bones cracking, shifting underfoot. "Keep moving," Tom said, his voice tight with fear. "We need to keep moving." But as they stumbled forward, one by one, pieces of their own bodies seemed to vanish. Ben was the first. His ankle twisted, and he screamed in agony as something pulled him to the ground, dragging him into the mist. Emily was next, her scream muffled as something cold and sharp gripped her arm, tearing it from her body. The others ran, the sound of their breaths heavy in the mist, their limbs moving in a frantic blur. But they all knew, that the bone collector was getting closer, collecting their bones piece by piece, until there would be nothing left. In the end, it wasn't the creature that killed them. It was the forest itself. The bone collector didn't need to be a beast with sharp claws and gnashing teeth. It was the woods, the ancient trees, the mist, alive with hunger, forever shifting and changing, until nothing remained but the bones scattered at its feet. Story 9. The Eyes in the Trees. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just a few days in the wilderness, far from the constant hum of city life. Daniel had been hiking for years, spending countless nights under the stars, and he'd seen more than his share of forests. But this one was different. The trees in this part of the woods were ancient, towering over him like silent giants. They seemed to watch him with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He'd hiked deep into the forest, beyond where the marked trails ended. He wanted to get away from everything, the noise, the stress, the world he'd grown tired of. But something about this place was unsettling. It wasn't the thick mist that hung in the air like an old secret, or the silence that pressed in on him from all sides. It was the trees. He noticed them as soon as he entered this part of the woods, as if they had been waiting for him. Some of them had faces carved into their bark, crude, jagged faces, like masks made by long-forgotten hands. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe the weather playing games with his tired eyes. But the faces seemed too deliberate, too uncanny. The carvings weren't random. They were patterns, shapes that made him feel like he was being observed. But he shrugged it off, thinking it was just an oddity of the forest. After all, it was just a few trees, a little odd, but not enough to make him turn around. He set up camp by a small stream, the only sound the rush of water and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Daniel built a fire and sat back, watching the flames flicker in the growing darkness. He should have felt peaceful, alone in nature, with nothing but the night around him. But something gnawed at him. The trees. They seemed closer now, the faces on their trunks more pronounced in the dim light of the fire. He found himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see movement. But there was nothing. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He laughed at himself, trying to shake off the tension. "It's just the forest, Dan," he muttered under his breath. "You've been here before. It's all in your head." But the feeling didn't go away. The faces on the trees seemed to grow sharper in the flickering firelight, their eyes staring at him. He could almost swear they were moving, shifting. His pulse quickened, and he stood up, pacing around the campfire, as if the motion would help calm his racing thoughts. The wind picked up, causing the flames to dance wildly, and that's when it happened. One of the trees, an old, gnarled oak, shifted slightly. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. He could have sworn it hadn't been there before. The face carved into the bark of the oak was different. The eyes, which had once seemed dull and lifeless, were now watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. His heart began to race. No, it couldn't be. It was just a trick of the firelight, just the shadows playing with his mind. But as he turned away, the sensation of being watched only grew stronger. He looked back at the tree, and the face was still there, staring at him. But now, there was a slight tilt to the head, as if the tree itself had shifted to get a better look. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't explain it. He was alone, wasn't he? There were no other hikers, no one else around. The faces in the trees weren't just carvings anymore. They were alive. Or at least they were watching him like they were alive. He told himself he was being paranoid, that it was all in his head. But as the night deepened, he couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were closing in on him. It wasn't just the faces. It was the way the wind had died down, leaving only the sound of his breathing and the crackling fire. It was too quiet, too still. The trees were watching, waiting. He stood up abruptly, deciding to walk around, try to clear his head. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, and the firelight was barely enough to push back the dark. As he walked, he noticed more and more trees with faces carved into them. The deeper he went, the more unsettling it became. The faces weren't just random. They were different. Some had eyes that followed him. Others had mouths twisted into silent screams. A sudden movement caught his eye. He spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Just the trees, standing tall and silent, their faces still staring at him. He turned back to the camp, eager to get back to the fire, but the path he had walked just minutes before was gone. The forest had shifted. The trees were no longer where they should have been. It was as if the very landscape had moved, rearranged itself while he wasn't looking. His breath quickened. He was lost, and the worst part was that the trees were watching him. They were shifting, leaning in closer, closing in around him like a trap. The feeling of being followed was unbearable now. Every time he looked over his shoulder, the faces in the trees seemed to shift, as if they were moving with him. The eyes were everywhere, blinking, staring, watching his every step. He couldn't escape. He ran. His footsteps were frantic, the sound of his boots pounding the earth deafening in the eerie stillness. But no matter how fast he ran, the forest seemed to stretch on forever. The faces were everywhere now, leering from every tree. He could hear whispers on the wind, too faint to understand, but too clear to ignore. They were calling his name. He stumbled, falling to the ground. His hand scraped against the rough bark of one of the trees, and he looked up, gasping for breath. The face on the tree above him was smiling now, its eyes wide with a terrible knowing. The smile twisted, growing wider, more sinister, until it was too large for the tree, stretching across the bark like a grotesque mask. Daniel scrambled to his feet, his heart racing, but he could hear the whispering now. Too close, too real. You shouldn't have come here. He spun around, his mind a blur, but there was no one there. Just the trees, their faces watching him from every angle. They weren't just watching anymore. They were moving, shifting, bending in unnatural ways, their branches creaking like old bones. He tried to run again, but the forest had closed in on him. There was no path, no way out. The trees were everywhere, and the faces were now all around him, their eyes glaring down from the branches above, their mouths twisted in mocking smiles. He was trapped. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it was all he could hear. You shouldn't have come. It repeated over and over, until it was a chant, a chorus of voices rising from the trees. And then, as the night pressed in around him, Daniel understood. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a thing, an ancient thing, older than time itself. The trees weren't just trees. There was something else, something that had been watching, waiting for him to enter their domain. The faces on the trees weren't just carved into the bark. They were part of the forest, part of the land, and now that he had trespassed, there was no way out. The forest had claimed him. The last thing Daniel saw before everything went black was the face of the tree above him, its eyes wide and staring, and the twisted grin that spread across its bark. And then nothing. When the rangers found his body days later, there was no sign of struggle, no signs of foul play. Just a man, lying in the dirt, eyes wide open, staring at the trees above. But if you look closely, you'll see something else in the bark of the trees. Faces, eyes, watching, waiting, just like before. The forest never forgets. Story 10. The Black Bear's Shadow. The mountains were more than just a place for camping. They were a promise of solitude. The kind of silence that presses on your chest, that makes you remember the quiet corners of your mind you've long ignored. The kind of quiet that would drown out the buzzing of the world. But that silence could also swallow you whole, and the campers would soon learn that in ways they couldn't have imagined. Their campsite was nestled deep in the mountains, far away from the paved roads, far away from the world. No other campers had been there for years. It was the kind of place the locals warned people about, where the trees seemed to lean in a little too closely and the fog rolled in at night like an old friend. The stories about the black bear that roamed these woods were well known in the town below. But in a way, the campers, 3 friends eager for a getaway, had ignored those warnings. They were used to camping in remote places, places that smelled of pine and wet earth. And this spot, despite the whispers from the locals, felt like paradise to them. Alex, the self-appointed leader of the group, set up the tents with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't had a decent break in months. His friend Mark, a quiet, bookish type, and Lisa, a city girl who was more accustomed to skyscrapers than pine trees, helped as best as they could. The sky was painted with the fading hues of dusk as they built a fire, roasting marshmallows and joking about what kind of wild animal might wander into their camp. Probably just the black bear everyone keeps talking about, Mark said, his voice dry and unamused. It's probably just a myth, Alex shot back, his grin wide as he skewered a marshmallow with his stick. Local color? you know? Keeps the tourists coming. Lisa wasn't so sure. Her eyes kept darting into the woods, and the hair on her neck prickled in a way she couldn't explain. It was just a place, she thought. This deep, dense forest where the shadows felt like they had a life of their own. That night, they huddled close to the fire, telling stories, until the flames began to die. They didn't hear the wind rustle through the trees, or the soft scuttling of small animals in the underbrush. But then, they did hear something, a sound so quiet, they almost thought it was a trick of the night. A low, grating growl, distant but unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" Lisa asked, her voice tight with nervousness. "Probably just a deer," Mark said, though there was a hesitation in his words. But the sound was too wrong, too heavy to be a deer. Alex stood up abruptly, the firelight casting long shadows over his face. "I'll check it out. Stay here." Before either of them could protest, he disappeared into the trees. The night closed in around them, as if the forest itself was swallowing him whole. Lisa and Mark exchanged uneasy glances, but neither of them spoke. They sat in the dying firelight, the warmth of the embers flickering weakly against the cold that was creeping in. It was an hour before Alex returned, his face pale, his eyes wide. "Did you see it?" Lisa asked, standing up. Alex shook his head, taking a deep breath. "No, but the tracks are fresh. The bear's been here. We need to keep our food locked up tonight." They did as he said, securing everything in the bear-proof containers they brought. But even then, none of them slept well. The next morning, things felt wrong. When Lisa first opened her eyes, the sunlight filtering weakly through the trees, she knew something had happened during the night. The air felt thick, heavy, as though it was holding its breath. "Alex," she whispered, nudging him awake. "Alex, something's wrong." He blinked awake, eyes adjusting to the daylight, and froze. He was looking at the ground, at the food containers, which had been disturbed. The lids were off. "Mark!" Alex shouted, waking up the last member of their group. Mark groggily sat up, staring at the scene in front of him. The bags of chips, the granola bars, even the sealed jars of peanut butter, all of it was gone. The containers, once tightly sealed, were now torn open, their contents scattered like confetti in the dirt. The bear tracks were obvious, huge, clawed prints leading away from the camp. But it wasn't just the tracks that made Alex's stomach drop. It was the way they disappeared into the woods. They didn't just trail off in one direction. They twisted and turned, as if something had been circling them. Lisa's voice cracked through the silence. "We need to leave. This isn't right." But Alex didn't want to leave. Not yet. Not without figuring out what had happened. He followed the tracks, with Mark and Lisa reluctantly in tow, deeper into the woods. The trees grew thicker here, the air colder. The light barely filtered through the canopy, casting everything in a dull, muted hue. The forest felt dense and suffocating, pressing in on them from all sides. As they walked, they began to notice other signs. Strange markings on the trees, circular carvings that looked almost like eyes, staring back at them. And then, suddenly, they found it, a small cabin, almost hidden, as though the forest had swallowed it up and tried to forget it. Alex approached it cautiously, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling with unease. "I don't like this," Mark murmured. "This doesn't feel like a place people just forget." Inside the cabin, the air was stale. Dust hung thick in the corners, and the floor creaked under their feet. But it was the walls that drew their attention. Strange, disturbing drawings covered them. The figure of a bear, no, something that resembled a bear, was painted in dark, smeared strokes. But this bear had human-like features. Its eyes were too large, too intelligent. Its teeth were sharp, far too sharp for a normal animal. And its limbs, its legs, were twisted, not like an animal's, but like something that walked on 2 feet. "What the hell is this?" Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. Alex didn't answer. He couldn't. He was frozen, staring at the artwork on the walls. His pulse quickened. The drawings were getting under his skin. They were too lifelike, too real. The way the bear's eyes seemed to follow them. The way the images seemed to pulse with something just out of reach. "We should go," Mark urged, his voice tight with fear. But before they could leave, they heard it. A rustling sound, not far from the cabin, low and slow. The sound of something heavy moving through the woods. The growl was back. Only this time, it was much, much closer. Something in the trees was watching them, and they weren't sure whether it was the bear or something far worse. They made their way back to camp as quickly as they could, but the woods felt different now. More oppressive. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind, felt like it was a warning. They reached the camp, but it felt empty now, as though the forest had claimed it for its own. And then night fell. The woods grew louder. The growls came again, closer this time, circling around their camp. They could hear the trees rustling, the sound of something large moving just out of sight. And then, when the full moon rose above the tree line, the shadow appeared. It was massive, far too large to be a bear, yet it had the shape of one. The eyes gleamed from the darkness, watching them with intelligence, with hunger. The thing stood at the edge of the firelight, a massive silhouette, and it didn't move. It just stood there watching. That night, the campers huddled together in their tent, the walls of their small shelter feeling more fragile than ever. The shadow remained, circling their camp, waiting. The bear, if it was a bear, was not the predator they had feared. It was something far older, something that had learned how to use the forest, how to become part of it. By the time the sun rose, Alex, Lisa, and Mark were gone. No one knew exactly what had happened to them. But the locals say, if you venture deep enough into the woods, you'll find the abandoned cabin. And if you look closely enough at the trees, you might see the eyes still watching. The shadow still moves through the mountains, and it never lets go.